June 1944, Normandy, France. A German Panther tank, 45 tons of steel, armed with one of the most feared guns of the war, rolls through a hedgerow. Its crew believes they're invincible. 30 seconds later, the tank is a burning coffin. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The weapon you think, even close. What really killed German tanks in World War II will shock you, because the greatest myths of the war have hidden the brutal truth for 80 years. Today, we're tearing down those myths one by one with cold, hard data. This is the real story of how the Wehrmacht's armored giants watched any World War II movie. You know the story. Brave American Sherman crews, outgunned and outmatched, face down the mighty German Tigers and Panthers. The Sherman 75mm gun bounces off German armor like pebbles off a castle wall. It takes 5 Shermans to kill 1 German tank. The Americans win through sheer numbers, sacrificing men and machines in a grinding war of attrition. It's a compelling narrative. It's dramatic. It's Hollywood gold. There's just one problem: almost entirely wrong. Let's start with the most inconvenient truth of all. When we talk about what knocked out German tanks, we need to understand where German tanks actually fought. And here's the number that changes everything. Approximately 75 to 80% of all German armored forces fought on the Eastern Front, against the Soviets. Not the Americans, not the British, the Russians. That means for every German tank destroyed in France, Italy, or North Africa, 3 or 4 were obliterated in the brutal furnace of the Eastern Front. So, before we even discuss weapons, tactics, or technology, we need to acknowledge this. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of destroying Hitler's armored warfare machine, artillery, not tanks, not anti-tank guns. Artillery. Regular indirect fire artillery killed more German tanks than any other weapon system in the war. Studies from both the Western and Eastern fronts consistently show that between 40 to 50% of all German tank losses came from artillery fire. Think about that. Nearly half of all those fearsome Panthers, Tigers, and Panzers destroyed in dramatic tank duels. They were blown apart by shells fired from guns they never even saw, located miles away. And it makes perfect sense when you understand tank design. Tank armor is thickest at the front. That's where designers expect enemy fire. A Panther's frontal armor was 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees, making it virtually immune to most Allied tank guns at range. But the top armor was only 16 to 40 millimeters thick. When an artillery shell screams down from the sky at a steep angle, it's hitting the tank's weakest point. But artillery did something even more devastating than penetration. A near miss from a 155-meter howitzer could rip off a track, damage the suspension, jam a turret, or cause a mobility kill without even penetrating the armor. And in World War II, a mobility kill was often a death sentence. A tank that moved was a tank that would be abandoned, captured, or finished off. Now, for the weapons that were actually designed to kill tanks, we need to talk about dedicated anti-tank guns. These accounted for roughly 25 to 30% of German tank losses. Talking about weapons like the Soviet 76mm ZIS-3, the British 17-pounder, and the American 3-inch M5. These guns had several massive advantages over tank guns. First, they were stationary or towed, which meant they could be made heavier and more powerful without worrying about the weight constraints of a tank chassis. Second, they had much lower profiles, making them easier to conceal. A camouflaged anti-tank gun in a defensive position was incredibly difficult to spot until it fired. And third, they were cheaper and faster to produce than tanks. German tank crews feared these weapons with good reason. A well-positioned anti-tank gun could destroy multiple tanks before being knocked out itself. The Germans themselves mastered this tactic with their famous 88mm flak gun. which became legendary as a tank killer, despite being designed as an anti-aircraft weapon. So if artillery killed half, and anti-tank guns killed another quarter to a third, that leaves a shocking realization about those legendary tank-on-tank duels we see in every war movie. Tank-on-tank combat accounted for only about 15 to 25% of German tank losses. Let me say that again. The thing that dominates every World War II movie, every documentary, every story about tank warfare, the epic clash of armor against armor, was actually the least common way German tanks were destroyed. And when tanks did fight each other, it rarely looked like the movies. Real tank combat was usually brief, chaotic, and decided by whoever saw the other first. The tank that spotted its enemy and got off the first accurate shot usually won, regardless of whether it was a Sherman, a T-34, or a Panther. See, Hollywood gives us panoramic views of the battlefield, but real tank crews were nearly blind. They were looking through tiny periscopes and gun sights, struggling to identify targets through dust, smoke, and vegetation. The German tanks did have better optics, and that gave them an advantage. But it wasn't the overwhelming edge that myths suggest. Let's kill another myth while we're here. The Sherman tank. It's been called a death trap and a Ronson lighter because of its supposed tendency to catch fire. But here's what the data actually shows. The Sherman had a crew survival rate of about 80% when hit, one of the highest of any tank in the war. German tanks, with their gasoline engines and ammunition storage, caught fire just as often, if not more. The real advantage of the Sherman wasn't numbers, though America did build a lot of them. It was reliability, ease of repair, and mechanical dependability. A Sherman broke down far less often than a Panther or Tiger. And in warfare, the tank that's actually running is infinitely more valuable than the theoretically superior tank that's sitting broken in a field, waiting for spare parts that will never arrive. But we're still not done with the ways German tanks died, because there were killers that operated from an entirely different dimension: air power. Aircraft accounted for roughly 10 to 15% of German tank losses, but their impact went far beyond just the kills they scored. Allied fighter bombers, particularly after D-Day, made daylight movement almost suicidal for German armor. Tanks had to move at night, hide during the day, and even then, they consumed precious fuel repositioning to avoid airstrikes. Planes like the American P-47 Thunderbolt with its rockets, the British Typhoon, and the Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik specialized in ground attack. Were they as effective as their pilots claimed? No. Pilot reports massively overclaimed tank kills, but they didn't need to destroy tanks to neutralize them. Forcing German armor to hide, disrupting supply columns, destroying fuel trucks, all of this degraded German combat effectiveness, even without scoring direct hits. And that brings us to the most overlooked killer of German tanks: logistics, or rather the lack of it. Historians estimate that 20 to 30% of German tank losses during the retreat from France and the final collapse in 1945 weren't from combat at all. They were abandoned, out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of spare parts. Crews blew them up or simply walked away. German tanks were mechanical marvels, but they were also mechanical nightmares. A Tiger tank got about half a mile per gallon of fuel. Half a mile. As Allied bombing destroyed German fuel production and supply lines, German armor increasingly found itself immobilized not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. There's one more factor we haven't discussed, and it's the most important of all: people. In 1943 and 1944, the quality of German tank crews began to plummet. Early in the war, German Panzer crews were elite, highly trained veterans. By 1944, German tank schools were pushing out crews with minimal training, sometimes with as little as a few weeks in their actual tank model, before being thrown into combat. Meanwhile, Allied crews were getting better. Soviet tankers, who suffered catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, became increasingly skilled and tactically sophisticated. American crews benefited from excellent training and, crucially, a replacement system that rotated experienced tankers to training units to pass on their knowledge. By 1945, many German tanks were crewed by boys, 16, 17 years old, facing Allied veterans. It didn't matter that the German tank was technically superior. The crew inside made all the difference. So what truly knocked out German tanks in World War II? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't what the movies show you. Artillery killed the most, nearly half. Anti-tank guns killed another quarter to a third. Tank-on-tank combat, the legendary duels we all imagine, accounted for less than a quarter. Aircraft added another 10 to 15%. And logistics, the unglamorous reality of fuel, parts, and supply, claimed perhaps a quarter of all losses through abandonment and breakdown. But beyond the statistics, beyond the weapon systems, there's a deeper truth. German tanks weren't defeated by any single weapon. They were defeated by a combination of industrial capacity, tactical evolution, strategic bombing, logistical warfare, and ultimately by an enemy that refused to quit and learned to fight smarter. The Germans built incredible machines. The Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, these were formidable weapons. But warfare isn't won by the best individual weapons. It's won by systems, by logistics, by training, by numbers, and by the courage of the men who crew those machines. That Panther we saw at the beginning, burning in a Normandy hedgerow, it might have been killed by a lucky Sherman shot. More likely it was destroyed by an artillery shell from a gun 5 miles away. Or maybe it was hit by a British anti-tank gun hidden in the bocage. Or perhaps it was struck by rockets from a fighter bomber the crew never saw coming. Or maybe, just maybe, it ran out of fuel 20 miles back, and the crew blew it up themselves before retreating on foot. That's the reality of war. Not glorious, not simple, but true. For 80 years, we've told simplified stories about tank warfare. Now you know the complex truth. If this changed your understanding of World War II, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. What surprised you most about these statistics? The next time someone tells you it took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, you'll know the truth. Thanks for watching.